So, fast forwarding a little bit, since you talked about him being a kid, what was he like as a young activist?
Well, at first, he was, at UC Berkeley, he was, well, graduating from high school, there's the stories about him, how he had to fight to get his diploma because he hadn't had physical education or PE or driver's ed and PE are things that they cited that he had to stay in school a bit longer because he wouldn't want a cheap diploma, would he? And so that was, he was part of that fight with my mom and dad to get him that his high school diploma. So that was he got a good example from my mom, not willing to have him go to high school another year. He was ready. He was a good student. He took all the classes. She offered to sit behind him in the car. He could sit in the driver's seat. She'd reach around and hold the steering wheel. If they could operate the gas and brakes for him, then it'd be fine. She could pass it, but she was sort of sarcastic about it. But then going to Berkeley, it's like we didn't know that he was really breaking. It's not exactly a taboo because it just wasn't spoken. People just didn't apply who were as severely crippled as he was. So that was just the fact that he applied and got into UC Berkeley and found a place to live there and did well at it. So that was activism personified. And then as the other students started to come in, they'd hear about my brother being okay because he'd be in the newspaper. He liked the publicity. And so he'd get in the newspaper for being a helpless cripple attends Cal was the daily Californian headline. And so that attracted other students. And then just together advocating for themselves, mostly at first with the Voc Rehab, the people who were kind of supplying funding for students when they started to get a little heavy-handed and being directors of these kids and telling them what they could study and what they could graduate in, which is just none of their business. They thought it was they need a job that they could a realistic job that they could get paid for, and that would define how vocational rehabilitation would be doing their job is to oversee. But these kids, pot smoking Berkeley hippie cripples, they weren't taking it. And so that's when they put up a stink and advocated for themselves and reached out to the media, to newspapers, and had their own spin on what they were doing and what they needed that became the current narrative of disability. So it kind of came on them just as a natural outflowing. And then, of course, Ed was studying political science at Berkeley and had some like Nelson Polsby and other professors who were quite influential in civil rights because the Black civil rights movement was in full swing in the mid 60s. And then women's rights, he was very interested in women's, empowerment. And so he saw how it worked for Black people and for women, for other people who were trying to gain equality and advocate for themselves. He learned from that, and then of course getting picked up by Jerry Brown when in '75 when he got hired by Jerry Brown to be the director of vocational rehabilitation. So that's when he had some money and power. He had 22,000 employees under him and millions of dollars of budget to start other independent living centers than the Berkeley one, and so that's when earlier than that, of course, getting the first curb cuts, off of the campus. They were all up at the hospital, at Cowell Hospital, and to go and have a beer and a pizza down in Shattuck, you had to get off campus, and the only way off was off driveways. And a lot of times you'd end up right in the middle of a street, and it was dangerous to go in between parked cars and come out on the street. They needed places like at Bancroft and Telegraph. A little down from there, we attendants put in the first ramps. We poured cement to let them off campus in their motorized wheelchairs, because most of them by this time had electric wheelchairs. So they were kind of new things. So that was then having our next door neighbor in Berkeley to my mom's house on Ward Street. Our next door neighbor was a city councilor, Lonnie Hancock. She later became the mayor, but she heard about the need for curb cuts, and we brought it before the city council, and they made a proclamation in this kind of a socialist, radical, progressive city council and mayor. They vowed that they would make every curb in the city accessible and have a curb ramp. So my friend Eric Dibner, another attendant, he mapped the city, worked for the city, and he mapped which ones were the most critical ones to get done first for the students on campus, and later was different routes for people in chairs, and later for blind people too, to have distinguishment with textures and dots, so that because there was outcry from the blind community that having curb cuts would endanger them. They wouldn't know where the sidewalk ended and the street began. So that was quite a lesson. There wasn't one thing or the other. You have no curb cuts or curb cuts. It's how to modify things so that it's universal, so that those curb cuts will work for people who are blind too, that they'll know they won't walk out into the street. So I'd say the activism just really naturally flowed out of what his role was as an initial student at Berkeley and at his high school, of being a successful student and being encouraged by my mom to get out and be in the world and just live it, give me my freedom. My mom wanted her own freedom. She wanted freedom for him too. She didn't want him being dependent on her. So he learned how, from being just totally paralyzed, not even able to essentially breathe for himself, to being totally responsible for his own life, to hiring attendants and to advocating for himself, asking for what he wanted, and very forcefully asking for what he wanted. So it was a personal journey first, and then it quickly became a societal through the schooling, and then through the state, and working with Jerry Brown and then of course World Institute on Disability, and traveling around the world and advocating for people and appearing on Russian television. That was a big thing to go to someplace where it was very, very backward still, with people in wheelchairs or for cripples to be not seen in public, it was very shameful and very, very much that was the norm, just to keep them hidden away and out of sight, and just keep them alive outside of, when he went on radio and television in Russia and demonstrated, here's a person, this is a new example of what it means to be a human being. You can look like me and be powerful and out traveling the world and advocating for yourself. When he died, there were 800 to 1,000 people at his memorial service in the basketball Harmon Gymnasium. 2 people from Russia came up to me, 2 people with disabilities came up to me and told me what my brother had meant to them. It meant that he was their savior, their rescuer. They didn't know anything, that they could have anything other than a horrible shut up existence. And here they were traveling halfway around the world to be at his memorial service, and several other people. But the 2 from Russia were the ones that I really remembered, just how it affected. I'm very proud of how he was able to help liberate people.
Yeah. Must be really, since you know him real well, since he was on Russian TV, and kind of, I don't want to say they idolized him, because that's not the right word, but they kind of was like a beacon of hope for him. Am I right in thinking that? Like he was maybe a beacon of hope for people maybe younger to kind of not have that life of.
Yeah, it's kind of a delicate tightrope in describing it, because because he's a super cripple, but he's not a super cripple. He's just a normal human being. So to make it like you got to be a super person just to be out on the street and have a job and be a father, that's not right. That's not it. But at the same time, being born at the time he was, and in the circumstances he was a model and an example and a beacon of hope for people. So he just was that. That's true. But if he's a beacon of hope with a light that shines that says you too, it's not just me, or it doesn't take a superhuman effort. It just takes a human a human effort and acceptance of yourself and accommodations for people to have
Yeah.
a structures in a society that is accommodating and welcoming and workable.
How did he handle that tightrope act of being that beacon, but yet also just being human too? Because I'm sure he wasn't probably. I don't want to say. I'm sure he had his moments of like self doubt and self pity and not wanting to be Mr. Center of Attention. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think more and more as he learned that he was a role model and he was an example of for other people, that he was being looked at. You know, how do you handle yourself? So he became more strident, I guess is the word, more demanding, less contrite and conciliatory in his language. You know, would you please do this? He would like tell me, hey, rub my nose. You know, like he'd get like more like that. I didn't like it really, because before it was just sort of like, hey, Mark, would you rub my nose for me? He became like he was dealing with people who weren't his family, who were taking care of him. They were his workers. You know, they worked for him. He didn't have to ask please to rub my nose or feed me something. He was telling them what to do. He was their boss. So it was sort of weird for me as being a family member, where it was just kind of a polite and respectful thing to where we were equals, to being all of a sudden it felt like the way he treated me was like I worked for him. You know, it just was a little bit weird, but that was part of how he learned how to not be shy or demure about getting what he needed. And he was the boss of the people who worked for him. You know, he was paying them to work for him. It wasn't a favor. So that was part of the part of the learning process and the change in his languaging and his demeanor became more authoritative and self-advocating, rather than being soft and I don't know, and asking permission to get what he needed. You know, it was more strident. And he learned from other activists too, you know, like Judy Heumann and many others who were like Ed was less of a sit in and protest and demonstrate person, like Judy and others who you know, and Adapt and Wade Blank and people who were really fighting for their rights and not going to move out of the way, get their wheelchairs out in the street and sit in the way until and that was necessary in the 504 sit-ins. My brother was up in Sacramento, you know, working at the time, so he didn't do the 504 sit. He wasn't inside the building, but he was outside the building advocating for them, and he was fully in support of them. But he was more of a sweet talking guy, you know. He was more kind of like he got into the system and he helped change the system, and he didn't have to go and sit. You know, he got the newspapers, he got parents, he got other people to help advocate for him, and he got what he wanted. But and then going to the university with these other students, they had to do some fighting and demonstrating and really advocating in a tough way for themselves. But he was more of a sweet talker guy. You know, he could talk to people and just charm you out of your socks and get what he wanted that way.
Yeah, I've gotten that. Oh, that seemed to be a common thread of him being the sweet talker type of like deal. Yeah, no, he's. So, do you have any more funny stories or memories of Ed? I know you mentioned a couple, but
Yeah, you know, there's kind of the highlights, and he's been gone for 26 years now, a little over 26 years. And so a lot of it is, you know, memories of him. And I've shared with you, you know, just how a little bit discomforting it was to have him be more brusque and less gentle. But I didn't spend a lot of time with him in the last years, but he was very influential in my all my younger years, and then the early college years, traveling around with him for those 3 years from 69 to 73. I was, me and my younger brother, we traveled with him and were his main attendants, and my cousin too. So we had family that were his main attendants, and then we needed help from other people. But living with him and with other family members and other attendants down, there were always a lot of people around, there's so we always had a very active household with attendants, and their families would be welcomed in and eat with us and cook with us. We learned a lot of different nationalities would work for him: Black, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Mexican, different people in the attendant pool. Quite frequently, there'd be people who were less well off who were part of our circle. And so that's another thing. And my mom still has a house that's full of people, and people coming by, dropping in, having dinner parties. So it's always been a very social life for me. And I like my quiet time now, but I really like the way it was when Ed was around, and still is with my mom, still having that very open door policy, and very much remnants of other cripples and attendants and their other families of cripples. Just all those people are part of her life ongoing. Even at almost 102 years old, she still has that lifestyle of independence and taking care of herself. And so I think that's the biggest thing for me about Ed's life, is now my mom still goes on, and I'm going to spend Thanksgiving with her, so I'll go see her on my birthday is Thanksgiving, and so I'll go down there and hang out with her.
Birthday.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, but I think I feel pretty complete about the thing, and thanks for your interest. And also the Yo group has been, like, I've got some nice mugs from you people and some posters and things. So I really like how you folks celebrate the history and acknowledge some of the early activists. Thank you.
Yeah. We have a couple more questions, but I promise we're almost done. I'm sorry, I kind of ad-libbed some of. There's questions I'm supposed to ask you, and there's some questions that just came up because I'm curious, and but not every day you get to talk to Ed Roberts' brother. So, but how is Ed trying to create his support system within the disabled community? I guess that started at Berkeley. Am I right to think that?
Well, so for himself,
or kind of build it.
At first, so my brother Ron was with him when he first went to Cal to live on the campus there. And then they had to find, and I don't know exactly how he found attendants there, but he probably had some help in finding people who could be his attendants, and then learning how to fire people. That was one of his first, he had this one attendant, a young Black guy who was, I guess, quite depressed, and turned out wasn't doing such a good job for my brother. He would be late and, just wasn't dependable. And so my brother had to learn how to fire him. So that was one of the things he learned was not always, don't accept all the help you get. It's like you're paying the people, you get to be the boss and say. And then they got an attempt as more and more. By the time we moved to Berkeley, my mom and me and my younger brother, there were 9 disabled men living there on the ward. And so it was our friends and their friends who would become, hey, this person needs an attendant. You want to learn how to be an attendant? So there were jobs for people, pretty good paying job, like $3 or $4 an hour. It was like getting paid good, and it was fun working for these people. I mean, it was a job, and in some ways beyond our usual comfort levels of dealing with bowels and bladders and catheters and medical stuff and equipment. But mostly these are young college people having a good time. So they were fun, funny, smart people who were there in the first place. This is kind of the cream of the crippled crop, it's that we saw there. So it was pretty easy in those days at Cowell, I think, for people to find attendance. And then I had all the work I wanted, working for Ed, for John Hessler, for Jerome Frazee. I had like 8 or 9 cripples that I worked for, and as you became known, you'd be there, and then you could put somebody else to bed or get somebody else their meal or fix their wheelchair or whatever we did. But So then there became at the PDSP, Physically Disabled Students Program, there was an attendant referral service. And of course, CIL also continued that, just, of transportation and mechanical stuff for electric wheelchairs and other medical equipment. And then just attendant care became, there would be a pool of people who could be referred out. And I think it's still a problem for a lot of people with disabilities, is to find dependable, quality attendant care, and to be able to afford it too. It's like, I think it's still a big challenge.
What should youth be advocating for to help carry out EGG's legacy?
Well, earlier this afternoon, I'm the president of the board at LILA, our Lane Independent Living Alliance. So besides helping take care of my mom and visiting with her and celebrating life with her and keeping her going, I'd say that working with still working today, we were addressing a busy intersection that just got built that didn't have access for wheelchairs. We had to go and put pressure on the city to do that. So it's an ongoing struggle just to keep basic transportation and infrastructure to acknowledging people with disabilities. We have to keep so my own role with LILA and being part, it's just once a month board meetings is mostly what I do nowadays, but I used to go in every week and visit with our director. But being acknowledging of independent living centers, that's part of my brother's legacy, is all these hundreds of independent living centers that are they're part of the infrastructure of our country and our world now. And so I just see my part with LILA here just to be a little continuance of the Roberts family and in independent living.
What about you? How should they kind of get involved and help carry forth the legacy?
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of times young people with disabilities don't realize what it was like before a lot of the advances, and they don't see the need for an independent living alliance or independent living center. So keeping youth's eyes open to the history and what it's been before and how much work we still have to do. It's the better we are at advocating and getting things changed, the less it becomes apparent to youth the necessity of continuing the pressure and the support of independent living centers and political advocacy. I think we can't get complacent. We have to keep things like Crip Camp, the movie Crip Camp, and kind of looks back at how things have been and how we've gotten to be. So I think the work we're doing with my brother is one thing, to make it palatable and interesting and accurate and complete. I think that helps just to keep people's eyes on that it wasn't always the way it is now, and it can change for the better even now.
All right. And then final question before I let you go. What would be EGG's dream for the disability community today?
Oh, it'd probably be something I haven't even thought of. It's like, well, part of it I think is like seeing people from all over the world and I've seen several delegations through MIUSA, Mobility International USA. They're here headquartered in Eugene, and we've had interactions through LILA, our Independent Living Alliance, inviting those folks over. And I think just a continuing, maybe the eradication of polio in Afghanistan and Pakistan now, that was a big, one of Ed's kind of sidelights, was making sure that other people didn't need to get polio who didn't need to get it. So we're still working on that. We've pretty much got it under control, but there's still a few places. And I just heard yesterday about the Taliban starting some anti-polio drives, because they weren't letting the United Nations or the international delegations go, because the CIA used some of that polio eradication door-to-door stuff in a military way. And so I think the Taliban and it was a terrible move on their part to exploit that because it got distrust of the vaccine people for polio. So I think the continuation of that work, and of course, I'm just totally clueless really what he'd be working on now if he was still alive, but it was probably the stuff that Judy Heumann and other people who are involved in politics at a high level continue the work and keep advocating in high levels of government and keeping our local independent living centers and local governments open to people with disabilities. I think that's some of it, I'm sure. Okay.
Well, yeah, thank you.